Please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Pamela Parmal.
Right. Thank you, Jasmine, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my really great pleasure to be able to speak to you about Dutch dress today, but I have to admit I'm actually not much of an authority on Dutch dress. And in all honesty, I don't think anyone really can be an authority on Dutch dress. And that's really because so little has actually survived. So really what we know about Dutch fashion and costume relies on what we find in paintings and written resources. So that's what I want to really focus on today, is what do the paintings that we see in that beautiful exhibition downstairs tell us about Dutch fashion, and also what do they not tell us about Dutch fashion? What about it that is not obvious when we look at the paintings, but maybe we can find out from other sources. So that's really the theme of today's lecture. And to start, I wanted to focus on this image, which is the cover of the catalog, which I think is a really good entry into a discussion on fashion in Dutch painting. Of course, most of you know the image from the publication and the catalog, and it's wonderful because it actually shows three different classes, and it was part of the section on the show on classes mixing together. The itinerant merchants in the doorway, of course the lady of the house who sits at the left, and then the figure on the right side who is actually a maid in the house. And I think for some people, for us today, her role as a maid might not be too clear. She and the seated woman are wearing very similar garments, shirts or jackets and skirts with white aprons. They look rather similar. But of course, someone in Holland in the 17th century would have known immediately that the woman on the right side was a maid. And one would have known that, of course, by probably the materials out of which the garments are made. And I think in the Dutch paintings, cloth is incredibly important. To me, a lot of these paintings are all about the cloth and the way in which the artist depicts the cloth. So I wanted to begin this talk talking about textiles and why they look the way they do in the paintings. What about the way that they're made and the fibers gives them the characteristics that these artists were so brilliant at achieving on canvas. Now, the woman on the left, of course, is probably wearing silk, a lighter silk top that I think is probably lined. It's not quilted, but it probably has a batting inside, like a silk batting, which would make it extra warm. She's wearing a heavier silk skirt, of course, trimmed with gold, so these are really kind of key elements which give us her status. The maid on the right, I think she's wearing a linen bodice, which is probably dyed with indigo. This would be a much more practical garment. It would be easier to clean. The dark blue indigo would not show up the stains so well. So something that a servant would wear. And her skirt, to me, looks like it's probably wool, a red wool. And they're both wearing linen aprons, which I'll talk about a little later. Now, this portrait, I think, is a great example of how textiles show different classes. Another portrait that's in the exhibition that, to my eye, is an interesting study of cloth is the portrait of the Kerkhoven family, which shows many different types of cloth, and most of them woven with silk. I should stop here a bit and make a distinction between the fiber out of which something is woven and the structure in which it is woven. So the main fibers that you find in Holland at this time are wool, silk, and linen. Linen is very important in the Dutch economy. I think they really built their economy on the linen trade in the medieval period and even earlier. There was a lot of linen cultivated in Flanders, in Germany, that was sent to the Netherlands, where it was processed and woven and finally bleached, and I'll get to that a little while later. So linen is very important. Silk, of course, was traded from the east, I think first through Turkey, through those trade routes, and then once the Dutch began trading with the global shipping trade from China and the Far East. Wool came probably locally as well as from England. The English were great exporters of wool. That was one of their main exports, so you would find it coming in from there. Now, this portrait, of course, because of the wealth of the family, shows them all wearing silk garments. And one thing I want to say, too, is some of these garments, to my eye, don't look like things somebody in the Netherlands in the 17th century would have actually worn. I think especially in the costume that some of the men are wearing. I think in the 17th century and into the 18th century, there's a growing fashion for creating portraits that are more timeless. So you would put the subjects into more classical dress and not into the really fashionable textiles of the day, because fashion changes, so the portrait would not look so timeless anymore. And there's also part of this trend is the painter's, I think, preference for painting unpatterned silks, like you see in the painting here. So you don't see in the paintings downstairs a lot of patterned silks, and again, I'll show you the few paintings that have those silks in them a little bit later. But this detail I want to focus on and talk about the different structures that are used with silk. And these textile structures you can weave any fibers in these structures. So the first one I want to talk about is a plain weave, which is the very simplest of the weave structures. And that, if you look at the young man, let's see if I'm getting at the top right, who is wearing the kind of aubergine or brown-colored silk shirt, that to me looks like a plain weave cloth, probably a taffeta, which is a lighter, crisper cloth. And here's a detail showing his shirt. Those of you who are familiar with taffeta can kind of see that quality that the artist has been able to achieve, that crispness in the way that it drapes on the body. It doesn't kind of drape cleanly on the body. There's those folds in there that are characteristic of that crisper fabric. Now, the diagram on the right shows you a plain weave, which is the simplest over and under. Over one, under one structure. And the warp yarns, which are the yarns that are on the loom, they're placed on the loom, and the weft yarns are interlaced with it by the weaver, kind of over one, under one. So that's the most basic structure. That's the plain weave. Another basic structure is a satin weave. And the young woman to the left of the painting, she is wearing satin cloth. And satin is a structure where the warp floats over 4 or more weft yarns. And the binding points are in kind of scattered different intervals. And you get a very smooth surface on the cloth itself, and those silk yarns are very reflective. So that is one reason why with satin you get that much smoother appearance than the plain weave taffeta, and the light reflects off the silk in such wonderful ways. You can have a cotton satin, you can have a linen satin, you can have a wool satin, but silk is the most effective yarn in creating a satin weave. There's also a softer drape to satin because you don't have as many binding points in the weave itself. So her outfit is satin. Another weave that you find in this painting is velvet weave, which the artist so beautifully depicted in the clothing of the parents, the Kerkoven, Mr. and Mrs. Kerkoven. And you see with velvet is characterized by a pile. And unlike the other two structures I showed you, there was one warp and one weft. In velvet weave, you have a supplementary weft. It's each pile weft, which you see from the top to the bottom, is wound on a separate bobbin that's held at the back of the loom and pulled into the structure when needed. So just very briefly, the weaver would do 3 weft shots of plain weave, and then the pile warp would be brought up and over a rod that's inserted by the weaver. Once the weaver does like 3 more rows of plain weave and locks in that pile warp, you can actually pull out the rod, and if you don't kind of cut the top of the loop before that, you have an uncut pile, which is a loop on the surface of the cloth. Most of the rods have a small groove at the top where you can easily run a knife over it. So in that way, the loops are slashed, and that creates the pile. So you can see the cut yarns below and then pulling out the rod above. So it's a very time-consuming weaving technique. And it uses more than twice as much silk when you're weaving it. So velvet was a very, very expensive cloth during this period. Now, velvet can be woven kind of plain velvet, as you see here, but also if you look closely at some of the portraits, you'll notice some of them are wearing cloth that looks like a patterned velvet. And in this portrait of the syndics from the Amsterdam Goldsmiths Guild, the man on the left is actually wearing a patterned velvet. It's like technically known as avoided velvet because you have usually a satin ground with the pattern coming out on top of it. And I pulled out from the collection a fragment of avoided velvet that is in the museum's collection, which you see on the right. And this is a satin ground that's kind of deteriorating, so you see some holes in there. But you see the pattern is created using a pile and also a cut and uncut pile. So the two of them there are combined. The duller areas in the middle of the flowerets are the uncut pile, and the blacker areas are the cut pile, because once you cut the loops, they kind of fringe up and create this really rich, deep quality that you see in velvet. Now, the fourth structure that I haven't mentioned, which is a very basic structure, is a twill weave. And I don't think you really see that in the Kerkhoven family portrait. Most often, twill was used in wool to weave wool cloth, especially broadcloth. And it's probably the structure that is used to make Constantine Huygens' doublet and hose that you see here. And it was a structure that is a kind of a slightly more complicated than the plain weave because the weft will pass under a number of warps and then over another number, and each subsequent weft will shift. So you get this real diagonal that's created. This twill is a 2-2 twill, so it's under twill, over twill, shifting one warp over, and which is why you see that diagonal. And like the satin, you get a longer float on the surface of the cloth. And the wool fiber is characterized by the fact that the fiber itself has a lot of scales on it. So you can felt wool very easily and create a very impermeable surface, which is what happens with broadcloth and the doublet that Huygens is wearing. It would be very practical for an outdoor garment because the lanolin in the wool would keep moisture from going through it, plus it would be a very durable fabric. So this kind of twill broadcloth is something you see a lot in menswear in the 17th and 18th century even. It does continue on. Now, along with all these plain fabrics, of course, there's also patterned fabrics, which were very common in the 17th century. We have, cabinets full of fragments of patterned fabrics from the 17th century. We know that they were around. We know that a lot of people wore them. But if you went through the exhibition downstairs, you probably wouldn't come out thinking that. There are a few paintings in the show that do depict pattern fragments, but I can kind of sympathize with the painters who wouldn't want to be there kind of with these ditzy little designs and creating the paintings. So the two daughters in this painting both are wearing patterned silks. The standing girl has a striped silk, and the other lady has a patterned silk. And this is an example in the museum's collection, which I think is very similar to the one that you see here. It has a satin ground and is patterned with a supplementary weft that goes all the way across the fabric and is brought up when you need the color. And actually, I don't know if you can see it in the slide, but at the bottom you can kind of see a pink stripe that goes all the way across, and then a blue stripe above that. That's it's a very thin fabric, so you can see that weft that's going across the back of the fabric, kind of coming through to the face of the fabric. And this fabric has a very soft hand. So it's something that could have easily been sewn into this dress with this very complicated pleating where the skirt joins to the bodice. But this gives you an example of the kind of patterned fabrics that were probably quite popular, and there were probably a lot of people wearing this kind of silk in the mid-17th century. Now, another painting where you can see a patterned silk is this one by Ravenstein of the Officers of the White Flag. And the gentleman in the middle, and I want to get his right name for you, Isaac Schnuens, is pictured wearing another patterned silk. And it turns out that he was actually a silk merchant. So it kind of makes sense that he would insist that he be depicted in this garment, and you see him. And what's also fun about this painting and this doublet is the fact that the Metropolitan Museum of Art has a doublet in their collection which is very similar. I think when you start looking at the details in terms of the pink tape that binds each of the straps in the sleeve, and even the little epaulette at the top, you can see the same pink tape that's been used there. It's a really wonderful comparison, and I think proves the point that these garments were actually worn, and there were probably a lot more in the 17th century than we're aware of, or that paintings would provide a clue toward. So I think it's important when we look at these fabrics or at the paintings to really be familiar with the types of fabrics that were worn, and we can, I think, even appreciate the paintings more, but also get a better sense of, what costume in the 17th century was really like, and that what people were wearing was much broader than the choices made by the painters and the subjects in the painters' paintings. It was a bit of a different story, I think, on the street than on the canvas. Now, I want to talk for the rest of this presentation. I want to discuss a few other aspects of costume that I think come across when you look at the paintings, and then another topic that is something that you really don't get from the paintings, but I think is important when thinking about Dutch costume during this period. And I think I'll start this discussion with this really wonderful painting of Dam Square. And if you look carefully at all of the figures in the painting, you really get the sense of what a cultural, kind of cross-cultural meeting place this square was, and all of the different types of peoples who met here, not only different social classes, but also people from different cultures, people from the city, people from the provinces, all coming together in a place like Amsterdam. And I pulled out a couple of details of individuals from the painting just to give you a sense of the variety of people that are depicted in the painting. Of course, in the upper left is a maid, one of the servant girls, who's probably out doing her shopping. In the middle are some merchants or who are discussing business in the square, a peasant on the right who has, brought his wood in to sell at the markets. There's a more aristocratic, wealthy couple on the bottom left, and we know that because she's wearing a full-length dress, which is something that really only very wealthy women were able to afford and wear. And in the middle are what look like a few Turkish merchants who may have been in Amsterdam at the time and with the trade going on. And on the right, I think you see a couple probably from the provinces, and that is their more regional style of dress that they have, come into the city wearing. And so the picture really does give you a sense of this wide diversity of costume that was going on at the time. And I think also in probably the lectures you've heard previously, maybe I've talked a lot about the trade that was going on and all of the people that were coming into the city because of that. Also the wealth that was coming into the Netherlands because of the trade. And that wealth allowed a lot of people to dress in fancier clothes, afford better fabrics. And this created kind of a lot of I think unease, social unease, to see people dressing above their station, or and people really kind of wanted to stick to the status quo. And I think part of what you're seeing in especially the genre paintings is an attempt to preserve that status quo. And so I think painting those genre paintings actually provide a fairly good indication of what people were wearing, the types of clothing that people were wearing. They also help to kind of classify different types of dress. And I think the idea of classification is something that's very important during this period, especially in Holland. Along with the trade, there are also a lot of knowledge is coming in about different cultures, about the natural world, and people are beginning to think about all this, document it, and I couldn't resist putting in this image of the tulip, which of course came from Turkey. It's really the beginning of the botanical drawings that you see during this period, and this beautiful work by Jacob Marl. There also leads to like Linnaeus classification systems, which develop in the 18th century. This is very much a part of the culture. And the idea of classifying costume is also something that you see even in the 16th century that goes on into the 17th century. And you see a lot of engravings and printed books that really look at costume. And they look at costume in the sense of kind of the costume of different cultures. This is a book by Julius Goltzis, and it shows you costume from various people from throughout the world. And this is a plate that shows you dress of Turkish women, what they wore at the period. But along with the dress from peoples of different parts of the world, the book also contains plates of people from different social classes. This plate shows you peasant dress from different regions around the Netherlands and the Flanders. The man in the middle, I think, is from Brabant, and to his right is a peasant from Flanders, and then to his right is another peasant from Belgium. So these books are part of this urge to classify, to kind of preserve the status quo. So people will continue to dress the way they should and not mix these social classes. And I think in Holland, there's a lot written about this, and for some reason the maids really, I think, bear the brunt of what you find in the publications. They're constantly being accused of dressing above their station. And which kind of brings us back to this portrait. And clearly, the maid in this portrait is not dressing above her station. She is very much of her class, and her role as a maid is quite clear, or would have been to a 17th century viewer. And I want to come back to this painting for another reason too, because I want to talk about linen. And linen in the Netherlands, as I said before, was a very important commodity. It was also a very important aspect of dress. And linen on a number of levels. One of which was that it was the basic undergarment was made of linen. There was a shirt that was worn by men and a chemise that was worn by women. And linen, unlike silk and wool, was very easily cleaned. So a poor person might have two shirts. One could be in the wash, and they could wear the other one. And clean linen was extremely important to the Dutch. And it was equated with kind of a moral, the cleaner your linen was, the better person you were. So this was an important aspect of the Dutch culture. And the finer the linen you had, the wealthier you were, was also an aspect of it. And I think in this painting, you can see that in different ways, which I think either further underscores the class structure in the painting itself. Both women, you can't really see their chemises. They don't really become visible until later in the 17th century, and that itself causes some scandal. But they both wear linen aprons, and the seated figure, it's a very translucent cloth. It's a really fine linen, not a very practical apron that she has on. And you can contrast this with the apron that the maid is wearing, which is a much denser, stiffer fabric. It's also a bit grayer to my eye when I look at it. It's not as, kind of brilliant white as the linen that the woman on the left is wearing. If you also look, you can see the colors of the men's shirts for the musicians in the background of the painting, and they are just gray. So I think here, even in the brightness of the linen, you're seeing the different social classes being revealed in that context. Now, as I said before, linen was an important commodity, and I just wanted to bring in this wonderful painting by Van Riesdael of the bleaching fields in Haarlem. And the idea of bleaching linen was extremely important, as you know, the brighter, the whiter the linen, the better. So the bleaching in Haarlem, they were very famous for how white they could get the cloth. And from what I read, it could take months to bleach the fibers to create that very brilliant white. They didn't really understand chemical bleaching, like chlorine bleach and borax, until the 19th century. So they didn't have access to that kind of chemicals. So a lot of this was done with sunlight and through various baths. I read somewhere that they actually used buttermilk, that they would bathe the textiles in buttermilk and then set them out in the sun to bleach. And you would do this kind of repeatedly until you got the whiteness that you needed. But the bleaching fields in Haarlem, they were well known for the whiteness that they could get their cloths. It also amazes me to think about how they kept bugs off, how they kept animals from running on them, how they kept them clean. It's just kind of extraordinary that they were able to achieve that. And then going back to this painting again, thinking about the linens, and I already said what I was going to say about it, so we'll move on to this next one, which is the idea of the cleanliness, keeping the linens crisp and clean and maintaining them, which is what this servant is doing in the basement of her home, or where she lives, ironing the linen on the table there for probably some kind of fashionable accessory, which were another important way in which linen was utilized in the 17th century. And in the maintenance of the linen, I think this drawing from Van de Venne's series of drawings is really about, it's not the bleaching fields of Haarlem. I think this is a wash day. And the two women with in the foreground with the ruffs and the standing collars are probably the women of the household who are overseeing the washing and bleaching of the family linens. And in the background, you see the servants who are working on the bigger pieces. One way I read to tell the difference between the maids and the mistress of the house is the maids often had blue aprons, and the mistress of the house had the white apron. Also, a maid would never have been able to afford that kind of standing collar that you see in the front. But here on the ground, you can see some of those linens, the shirts and the longer chemise here, and then also collars and cuffs and ruffs and the different kind of fashionable accessories. I don't think you would have seen this melange of types of things in the bleaching fields in Haarlem. I think this is probably a family laundry. But the amount of time and effort put into laundry was something big, and the value of linen in the household, I think this points to the care, the value, and the importance of linen in the Dutch household and in fashion. And so from here, I want to talk a little bit about some of these accessories, because it amazes me that these two women in the foreground could actually be out there wearing those standing collars. It's really quite extraordinary, because we see a similar collar in this painting by Irmgard Elizabeth van Dort, who was a member of the aristocracy. And from what I read in the catalog, the aristocratic portraits were all about wealth and money and position. And I think this portrait is certainly about that. The collar itself is made of, again, this very, very fine linen that they could achieve, this translucent linen that is pleated and then has a bobbin lace attached around it, or needle lace. It's unclear. It's not that carefully detailed here. But lace was actually also made of linen, because in Flanders, they were able to achieve a very, very fine linen thread that could be made into beautifully refined lace. So a lot of the lace in Europe first came from Italy, but then once the Flemish started and the Belgians started making lace, you see a lot of lace coming out of this area. And during the 17th century, more and more is incorporated into fashionable dress. And I think this is on these standing collars, you begin to see a lot of that. She's also wearing, I think it is a partlet, which is on the upper part of her chest, you can kind of see a circular wheel pattern in white behind all that jewelry. And that's an earlier form of lace called reticella, which is something that started in Italy and then moves up. So this standing collar, I was able to find out that there were several standing collars that have actually survived in museum collections. And this is one from the Cluny Museum in Paris. And the collars were actually supported by these wire frames, which this is the back of the collar from the Cluny. And you can see this wire framework, which was known as a supertasse. And the collars were then stitched to the supertasse. I think the collar that's on this piece now is probably not original. I think the supertasses were developed so you could do the main part of the collar to the center part, and then the lace where it came out would be stitched to those kind of tulip-like motifs that are at the top of the supertasse. And I think if you look closely at the portrait of Ermengarde and look at those points of lace, you can almost see these little white lines behind them. I think that may actually be the supertasse, and you're just seeing it where the lace didn't cover it and wasn't completely stitched down. Which is an interesting way of looking at that. But these were important accessories along with ruffs, which were both worn from the 16th century into the 17th century, and I think begin to go out of fashion by the 1730s. So this is about the time when Ermengarde's portrait was painted. Shortly after that, the standing collars begin to go out of fashion, but the ruffs continue on for a little while longer. And this, again, the Officers of the White Flag is wonderful because it shows you as the standing collars go out of fashion and this new kind of falling collar becomes much more fashionable, and you begin to see that supplant the standing collar. But the ruffs are still worn here and continued to be worn into the 17th century as for officials, like in the judiciary, lawyers, academics, they still continue to wear the ruff. In this portrait, there are two men with the ruffs on. They're a very soft kind of ruff. And the other men wear the falling collars. Here's a detail of one of the men with the ruff, and then a ruff from the collection of the Rijksmuseum. So you can see one has very soft pleats, and yards and yards and yards of linen bands were cartridge pleated around the top, around the band that would have gone around the neck. And sometimes there were layers of bands, so you get layers of ruffs. And the actual care and maintenance of these was extraordinarily complicated and time-consuming. And it was even more difficult. This one was fairly simple compared to ruffs like these. And they were heavily starched, and then you had to actually set the pleats in them. This is the Rembrandt painting of Maria Balkenal and the Reverend Ellison, and they actually lived in England, so the dress is a little more English. Her hat is something you would find in England, but I think it's a wonderful example of these stiffer ruffs that were worn. And he was a minister and an academic, so you have this more somber dress. And just because of the extraordinary excess of some of these ruffs, there are a lot of satirical prints. And this is a plate from a series called The Monkeys, and it's a depiction of the laundry. But it actually shows you the different stages that were used to clean and then reset the ruffs. Because once they were brought in, they were washed. The monkey in the back is actually washing the ruffs, and then they were set to dry. And then from there, they would go to the starchers, who are on the bottom left. They would actually starch the ruffs. And what's interesting is historians have discovered that sometimes you could color the starch. So sometimes they would have pink ruffs and blue ruffs, and it's harder to see now, but I think there may be one painting down in the show where I noticed somebody wearing a blue ruff, so that'd be like, where's Waldo? You can go back to the gallery and see if you can find the blue ruff in the gallery. But there you see the starching, and then the monkey in the center front is actually setting the ruff. And to do that, they had rods that you would heat and then insert into the ruff to create the pleat. And then there was enough starch that it really held its shape. And for ruffs that were up to 4 layers, you had to do this for every single layer. And it was really, they had, I think, plates that they inserted between layers so that when you were doing one layer, you weren't destroying the other layer and kind of ruining the pleats. So this is one area of Dutch fashion which really did go to excess, was in the types of accessories that were worn, and particularly the linen, because it was that important. Now, I want to go back to this painting again and talk a little bit about the falling collars, because here's where you start to see the lace come in. And lace was, again, a very valuable, expensive accessory. So it really did denote wealth because it was such a time-consuming thing to make. And here I just show you a detail from the painting, along with a piece of bobbin lace that's in the museum's collection. And this is kind of a crude piece of bobbin lace, to be honest with you. It's not so refined in terms of the pattern, and the weaving is not so crisp and like some of them you find later on. But I think it's the kind of lace that you might have seen on a collar worn by this gentleman. And it's created in the technique of bobbin lace. There are 2 different ways of making lace. There's bobbin lace and needle lace. And bobbin lace is sometimes called pillow lace because it's created on a pillow, and the threads used to make it are wound onto bobbins, which are then plaited to create the fabric of the lace itself. And bobbin lace often can look like a woven structure because the threads on the bobbins cross each other as if you were weaving. And they are done, that crossing is, you see the bobbins hanging off the left side. On the top of the pillow is usually a parchment drawing, a basic outline of the lace pattern, and it's pricked with holes into which pins are inserted. And the lace, those pins help guide the threads to create the pattern. And as the lace is made and woven together, the pins are pulled out, and then a new, then they carry on with making more lace, and the rest of it is wound up on the other side. So again, this is a time-consuming, very meticulous job, and something I think the people from this region really did excel in. So you see the lace maker here in this painting that's in the exhibition. And here's another example of bobbin lace from a slightly later period, and of the style that might have been worn by a woman in the Van Schuten family portrait. Here it's a little more refined, kind of denser design than the one we saw before, which happens as the century moves on. You get these more complicated patterns. Now, needle lace can give you a denser structure. And this is a piece of needle lace from about 1630, and it's very similar to another painting that's in the museum's collection. You get this kind of, it's a weightier lace than bobbin lace, and it's a crisper kind of lace. And the bobbin lace is amazing because it's made with a needle and thread. And it's a basic buttonhole stitch. For those of you who know anything about stitching or embroidery, the needle is wrapped into a previous stitch and brought through. And if you pull those stitches tight, you can create this very dense fabric. So if you can imagine the time involved in creating something like this, it's made similar to the bobbin lace in that it's created on a pattern. Early on, it was parchment onto which threads were laid just to outline the design and the pattern, and then the threads were filled in with this buttonhole stitch. and that's how you created this larger design. It was then kind of snipped off the parchment, and you had the free lace came off of that. So when you think about time put into these materials, you can begin to understand why lace was so expensive and why it was such a valuable accessory during the 17th and especially into the 18th century. I did some work on 18th century lace in the wardrobe of Madame de Pompadour and found out that a full suite of lace accessories for a dress was about as valuable as a suite of diamond sapphire jewelry. So it gives you a sense, of the value of this material at the time. It was very highly valued, an important fashion accessory. And then, of course, there were people who didn't wear such extravagant and elaborate accessories. And this painting, I'm going to of Abraham Castellan and his wife. He was, he was a Mennonite who ran a newspaper. And the Mennonites dressed much more simply, and you can see that in the simple white collar worn by he and his wife. I love the fabric of his suit, and I have a feeling it's a wool and silk blend. If you mix the two together, you get this kind of duller yet wonderful kind of glow to the fabric. So that's my theory, that this might be a wool and silk blend. And then just a picture of his wife, who, after he passed away, took over the newspaper, and I think became kind of the official printer of Harlem, which is kind of, she stepped into that position. And I just wanted to point out, too, at the bottom of her collar are these little linen tassels, which I think were quite common in the 17th century. It was just a little way of adding some kind of trim to your garment, and we have a lot of them in the collection for some reason. They must have been quite popular. Now, I hope I kind of wanted to discuss linen with you a little bit because I think it's a very important aspect of Dutch costume. The other aspect of Dutch costume that I wanted to talk about in more depth was the impact of the Orient and the trade with Asia and the huge impact it had on the Dutch and on what the Dutch wear, which I don't think is something you always see in the portraits themselves. So I wanted to discuss that a bit. And I just kind of opened this discussion with this wonderful illustration of the main street in Goa in India. And this was appeared in the Itinerario, which was Lynn Schoten's book that was published of his voyages with the Portuguese. He was the first to kind of publish some of these Portuguese trade routes and allowed the Dutch and a lot of other Europeans to begin to explore this more global trade and allowed them to really enter into the trade. But I think it gives you a sense of the exotic world that the Dutch and the Portuguese and Europeans encountered when they began to travel and connected with all of these cultures in India and the Far East. And I think this portrait of Hinlopen and his wife, which is in the exhibition, has several things about it that really point to his role in the Dutch East India Company. He was one of the directors of the VOC, and I think the feathers, which is probably ostrich, that cover the accessories that his wife wear, were brought in as a result of trade with Africa. You see a lot of ostrich feathers that begin to come in, and they become a very fashionable, important accessory. So she's showing those off. She also is showing off her jewelry. Diamonds and pearls were both came in greater quantity due to trade with Asia at the time, and I think you begin to see a lot more jewelry, pearls in particular. If you really look at the portraits and the paintings in the show, it's kind of amazing how many pearls you begin to see. And so I think she really is advertising his position as the director of the East India Company and the access he had to a lot of these real luxury goods that were coming through the trade. And this portrait of Amalia van Solms, who was married to the Prince Henrik, the pearls that she is wearing, I think, are actual pearls. I began to doubt the validity of a lot of the pearls in the portraits after I began seeing so many. But I'm pretty sure that she is wearing pearls she actually owned. And actually, there are records of Prince Henrik buying a graduated pearl necklace for a price of, what I think I figured was about 20,000 pounds, which was a huge sum of money. And this drawing by one of the leading jewelers in Amsterdam is of a graduated necklace that was bought for Amelia von Salms. So this is actual documentation of the fact that she owned the necklace and the teardrop earrings that you see here, which were bought by Kletcher at an earlier date. I think he paid 1,000 pounds for the 2 pearls. So freshwater pearls, I think it's hard for some of us now that the cultured pearl industry is so pervasive, but freshwater pearls were extraordinarily rare. And freshwater pearls of this scale or even rarer. So it's very hard to imagine that all of the pearl drop earrings you see in these Dutch paintings were actually real. And to get a strand of graduated pearls, the size that she is wearing is also amazing. So it accounts for the cost of the pearls that she is wearing. And I think her lack of a lot of other jewelry also points to the fact that they want you to focus on the real thing that she has on. I think this portrait is a little, I don't know that it's actually, again, something that someone would have worn. I think that the artist may be putting her in a more Renaissance style of dress. The fabric is something that would have been popular in the 16th century, this kind of very lavish velvet that you would find in Italy at the time. So I don't think the dress is quite right, but I think the pearls are right. So to go back to Kletcher's drawings of the pearls. And then I just wanted to bring in Elizabeth Taylor and La Peregrina, which is the pearl she is wearing. It's one of these very large, it's one of, I think, 2 of the largest pearls that are known. And it belonged to, I think, Queen Mary for a while. It belonged to the Spanish court before it eventually made it back to Britain and then was bought by Richard Burton for her, I think, for a Valentine's Day present. And I think he spent $37,500 for it at auction. When her jewelry sold, this necklace sold for like $102 million. So, yeah, it really value, but it gives you, I think there are only 2 of these that we know of that have survived, of these very large teardrop pearls. So they were a real important sign of wealth during this period. And I think when you see them on Amalia von Salms, who was a member of the important aristocracy, ruling family, they make sense on her. The smaller pearls that you see on Irmgard Elizabeth do make some sense as well, and especially the portrait as symbol of wealth. It makes sense to see this many pearls on her. Whether or not she actually owned them, I don't, that's up for debate. She also wears a lot of diamonds. The big kind of pectoral brooch that she is wearing on the rosette, plus the studs that encircle the bodice and drape down, those are all gold, enameled gold set with diamonds. And both diamonds and pearls, as I said, came in from the India trade. I didn't mention, the pearls were actually between India and I think it's Sri Lanka. There were a lot of very important pearl beds, and that's where a lot of the pearls were coming from. The diamonds were also coming from India, and they were also coming from Burma at this time and being shipped in to the lowland countries. In the 16th century, Antwerp was a very important center for the diamond trade, but by the end of the century when Antwerp was besieged, the diamond trade really moved up to Amsterdam in the 17th century, which I think is where it still rests today. So most of the diamond trading went on there. And so the diamonds are, again, a very important aspect of the Asian trade, and something I think that points to that wealth that was coming in through that trade. And then I just had to, of course, bring in the Vermeer. And looking at her pearl earrings, once you know something about the history of pearls and the rarity of this kind of pearl, it's pretty clear that she's probably not wearing real pearl earrings. And there was a recent article that was published by, I'll get his name for you. by Vincent Ike in a magazine called New Scientist. And he was really looking at the painting of the girl with the pearl earring, and noticed that the reflections weren't quite right. That the way the light reflected off the pearl was not characteristic of a way a pearl would show that. And I think the curators at the Moritz House were also a little unsure about whether or not the pearl was real. And it turns out there was an industry of like faking pearls. They were often made of glass, or one interesting way I found out that they were crushed fish scales could be formed into pearls. And this is something someone in a lower class could have afforded, and could well be something that Vermeer used in his paintings. There's also another Vermeer painting of a woman wearing probably this exact coat, which is an indoor ensemble that one would wear to keep warm. And it looks almost in the other painting, it looks to me like it may be a Chinese silk, but it's very hard to tell, lined with ermine. So that the idea of warmth in the home and this more informal dress is what you see in this garment. And I think this garment is a kind of a nice segue into the next section of the talk that I want to focus on, the clothing that was worn or that evolved out of the trade in a way. Because when the merchants began trading in the East, particularly when the Dutch began trading with Japan, some of the leading merchants were often given diplomatic gifts, which were these kind of versions of the kimono. And you see such an example here on the right. This is not really a traditional Japanese kimono. It's more like a robe that they used kimono fabric. Both the linings for kimono are this orange fabric. So everything about the fabrics are kimono fabrics. But the fact that it's completely lined in this silk batting to give it warmth, I think takes it out of a Japanese costume into something that was worn in Holland. And they become popular in Holland, and they become known as a rok. And you see a lot of merchants wearing them. On the left is the painting of the notary, and he's wearing a version of this garment. So again, this kind of indoor clothing, comfortable, warm, is a type of clothing that really begins to develop or you see a lot more of in Europe in this period. And I think maybe inspired by the introduction of this kimono-shaped garment into Holland in the 17th century. And the fabric out of which this is made is definitely Japanese, and you can probably find kimono from the late 17th century into the 18th century made of very similar fabric. So this garment, I think, continues on through the 17th century, and I think by the end of the 18th century becomes a very common type of garment in the period. And I love this painting of a family taking tea, because again, of course, tea was brought in through the trade with the East. So often tea drinking was done in one of the more private chambers of the house, and it's often where a lot of the Oriental goods that came in through trade, like the tea tables, the lacquered cabinets, a lot of these were put in England in particular, into these more private chambers. And it's where you would entertain your closest friends, maybe wearing these very loose-fitting garments called the rok. And they are, I think, really lead the way to fashion during the 18th century. They're kind of a transitional garment, and I think really important in terms of the history of costume, but maybe something nobody has really studied it in depth the way they should, because I think they had a serious impact on clothing in 18th century. So along with the rok, another, I think, big influence on garments in 17th century Holland and on textiles in general in 17th century Holland is the cotton trade with India. And I think this is something you really don't see in the portraits. I looked really hard to find a painting where you could actually see Indian textile in the painting, and finally found this piece in the museum in Munich. And it shows a family with a young daughter, and she is wearing a gown and probably a petticoat made out of Indian rhesus printed cotton. and I'm sorry the detail isn't that good, but it's probably a cotton that is very similar to the larger textile that you see on the right. During the 17th century, these very dark ground printed cottons were the kinds of things that were being exported out of India and brought into Europe. Now, cotton was known in Europe during this period, but it was not something that there wasn't a lot of access to it. The Europeans weren't familiar with the Indian dyed cottons. And what was special about them is the Indians had perfected techniques of using indigo and madder to dye very fast, brilliantly colored textiles. These things, they were very difficult to fade. It was very hard. They retained their color for a long time. This was not true of printed textiles in Europe at the time because they were trying to print on linen, which really doesn't take dye very well. And so you get these very muddy brown printed linens that are not that attractive. This material, which you could easily wash, kept its color, must have been a complete revolution to the Europeans. And during the 17th century, the trade in Risa's printed textiles just exploded. And I wanted to talk a little bit about this because of the connections to the Asia and the New World exhibition, where there are some printed textiles in that show. There are some wonderful connections between the two shows and the cultures during this time. But here on the left, you can see her wearing that printed cotton. And I think we don't really, when we think of Dutch 17th century costume, it's very hard to think of them wearing cloth like this because we so rarely see it in paintings. But I think there was a lot of it that was worn, and it had an important role in costume during this period, and the textiles as well. So I think from what I've been saying, I think you can get a sense that the paintings of the period, they do provide a good link to our understanding of what was worn in Holland during the 17th century. The kinds of garments that were worn, the types of fabrics that people loved, and the kind of aspirational jewelry, trims, notions, the high style you can really see in a lot of these paintings. But the paintings, too, I think leave out part of the story, such as the pattern fabrics, the silks that we looked at earlier, and also these printed cottons that were coming through and were extremely popular in the Netherlands at this time. And so I hope when you look at the paintings in the show, kind of keep this in mind. And I'll just close because I think this is true not only of the Dutch in Holland during this period, but also a lot of painting, especially portraits that were done in Europe and even in the US during the 18th century in particular. The fashion for painting plain silks, people in more classicized dress, not even accurate historical dress, is something you see in a lot of portraits that were done. And two, I personally feel that our impressions of what colonial Bostonians wear from the portraits of Copley and others is just not the case. Because if you look at the 18th century dresses that we know were worn in Boston during the period and the menswear, they wore a lot of patterned silks and very brilliantly patterned silks. So I think we need to kind of keep this in mind when we think about historic dress and using paintings as a source for them. And thank you.
So we certainly have time for some questions. We ask that those of you who are leaving now, please do so quietly so we can get on with the questions. Raise your hand and then we'll bring the microphone to you. We'll go over there first.
Hi, I have two quick questions. One is, how long would they wear those ruffs between washings? And also the red. I was surprised to see like the maids in such bright red. Wasn't red expensive dye?
Red. There was a lot of trade, let's see, well, the Ruffs, I really can't tell you. I think, the wealthier the family, probably the more often you could to wash and clean because you had the servants in order to do it, or you could send them out. So the interval between cleanings, I really don't know. But the red dye, cochineal from South America, is a very important dye that was part of this whole global trade. Very important. You got those really rich red colors from that. And there was also madder dye, which was known in Europe at the time, and a lac dye, which was coming from the East. So there was a lot of red dye coming into Europe at the time. You think of the redcoats, the British redcoats, a lot of that red was very popular and very accessible because of the trade. Natural dyes can get really brilliant. You can get beautiful color with natural dyes. It surprises people.
Thank you. In the exhibit and through the lectures, there appeared hairstyles were primarily pulled back under a cap.
Mm-hmm.
And 3 styles of caps: the plain white that the servants might be wearing,
Mm-hmm.
what I would call a witch's cap,
The black. Yeah.
witch's cap,
Mm-hmm.
and then it appears to have an inverted V deep
Mm-hmm.
into the forehead.
Mm-hmm.
And it almost looked, for most of the women, that they either had a receding hairline, or they shaved or pulled hair
Mm-hmm.
out so that they're very high foreheads. Could you comment on that, and does it have meaning?
Yeah, no, I'm afraid I can't. I'm not familiar enough with that beautiful, the idea of beauty at the time. I would, if I wanted to research the caps, I'd look at some of the regional styles of dress to see if that may be coming out of a specific region, because I think in reading about the maids, a lot of them came from different regions in the Netherlands and may have brought that with them, but I don't know enough about the cap styles to really comment on that.
If you could kindly comment by class, how many outfits, dresses or outfits, would a person of each class typically own?
I'd have to make that up. No, I don't know, but the little work I've done on French 18th century dress, someone of the poor class may have 2 chemises, a bodice, and a skirt, and that's it. A man would have a suit and maybe 2 shirts. And then you just kind of kept on washing the shirts and the chemises to keep things clean. Of course, as you went up the scale, the wardrobes increased until, like Madame de Pompadour's wardrobe, she had dress after dress after dress after dress. So I think it it varied according to spending and taste, too. So it's hard to say unless you did a really thorough survey of probate inventories.
I really enjoyed it, thanks. I have
Thank
a
you,
couple
Ronnie.
questions. Can you go back to the slide of the syndics? Because I have a question about one thing that they're wearing that looks like it's metal attached. Somebody's asked me about it, and I don't know the answer. So, and this was also an opportunity to talk about the ruffs, because somebody else noticed that there were 2 different kinds of ruffs, and I was told that...
Did I pass them? Yeah.
No, you haven't passed it yet.
Okay. I didn't-
No, that's
No,
not the
he was
syndics.
the black velvet.
Here you
Yeah,
go.
there we go.
Okay, so the man at the far left, what are those metal things hanging from his costume?
the eglets.
Eglets, what are
Yes,
they for?
they're eglets. They were, there's probably some kind of lacing going on, I can't tell from here. If the doublet is laced to the trunk hose, I'm not sure exactly, but they were usually put at the ends of laces, so you could insert them into the holes more easily and lace something together.
And then somebody else noticed about this very portrait that 3 of the men are wearing the same kind of collar, and the 4th is wearing a different. The guy at the far right is wearing a different kind of collar, and I was told that at a certain point, it's not a question of chronology, it's not a question of whether you're old and conservative versus young and hip, but rather that men at the time, it was like preferring a long tie to a bow tie, that the guy at the right liked that they would have specific kinds of collars that they preferred.
I
And
would,
thought that was
looking at
really-
the portraits, the group portraits, I would say that's probably the case, because even in the militiamen, you see a range of
Right.
colors as well. So I
So I
think
thought
it's
that was
taste.
really fascinating, that they're the same, it's the same age guys, it's the same period of time, and yet one guy preferred a different kind of rough
The one on the
collar.
right, though, would have been much more difficult to maintain. I would say he maybe is a higher status or somehow,
That's
had more
interesting.
wherewithal.
And then back to the Vermeer woman writing, I was told that's not ermine at all, it's rabbit, and it's made to look like ermine.
It could be.
And
I don't
we
know how they know that.
We know that jacket belonged to Vermeer, not to the woman. And
Is there
so-
an inventory with it in it?
Yes, there's
Yeah,
an
then that-
inventory with
then
it, but
they
I'm
may
not sure
well
it
know.
says rabbit, but I was told that's definitely not ermine, but I don't know
Okay.
how you tell.
All right. Looks like it.
We'll go over in the center there.
You said that not many of the textiles from the Netherlands in this period had survived. Was that generally true, or was it specific?
Well, not many of the actual garments survived.
Was that true generally in that historical period, or was there some reason that they didn't survive in the Netherlands?
I think the garments tend to get remade and reused a lot, and I think, as you go farther back in time, less and less just,
So it was a
survives.
general-
So it's a
historical-
general thing. There's far less from the 16th century and, on. We have more from the 18th, a lot more from the 19th. It's just part of time, takes its toll. We have a lot of fragments of textiles, some of which were part of a garment because of their shape or seam lines. So we can really, say, well, this was probably a doublet or this was probably that. We do have a lot of textiles. We've got thousands of fragments in the collection.
Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you. Very nice lecture.
Thank you.
I just wondered if the patterning was available for the bobbin lace.
Mm-hmm.
Did they use patterns or was
Oh, yes, they did. You would work right on top of a pattern, which would have the broad outlines of the design, and then you work from that.
So someone was making the patterns?
Yes, yes. Mm-hmm. I think there are a few that are extant, not a lot, but there are a lot of pattern books that start to be published at this time.
At that time? They
Yes, when, from the 15th century on, you start seeing embroidery pattern books, lace pattern books, a lot of that. They start a lot in Italy and then into Holland.
Oh, thank
So
you.
they were getting around.
Could you talk about how they cleaned those gowns and could they wash them?
Well, I don't know how much they wash them. I mean, part of the reasons for wearing the linen undergarments was to protect the outer garments. They were very conscious of that. I do know that they did know about some kind of chemical cleaning, like solvents that they could use to clean the garments. They would also dye things. If you got a bad stain on it, and it was, a white, they'd dye it a darker color to cover up the stain. So that the dyers' houses were very important in terms of, taking care of stained garments.
The India cotton was very beautiful, and they knew how to dye it, and they knew how to use the natural dyes.
Right.
And at some point, I think England actually closed the Indian factories.
Yes.
And they wanted to sell their calico.
Well,
I just was wondering about when this came about.
Yeah, the trade between the Dutch and India and cottons continued through the 17th into the 18th century. The cottons became so popular at the end of the 17th century that both France and England forbade trade in Indian cotton. And they didn't allow it to come back in again in France until, I think, 1759. By that time, people had begun to figure out the process and started to produce the printed textiles in both England and France. But yeah, they were banned for quite a few years. But there was so much smuggled, a lot of it through the Netherlands that went into France and England.
Hi. Can you comment on the Van Gogh painting that's at the MFA here, The Weaver? Just relating the kinds of fabrics you've talked about and the work and the materials being used.
To Van Gogh's paintings in the 19th century?
Yes, like what was the Weaver working with? And
in the 19th century, they would have still been natural fibers. They would have still, he's later in the 19th century. Industrialization in the textile industry really happens during the 19th century. And by the mid-century, you've got chemical dyes being introduced. So it's a very, very different picture in terms of what you're seeing in Van Gogh.
Hi, I have a question about lace. Did every household have a little lace maker,
Or
I
was
don't think so.
Oh,
I think it was a big business. It was a big industry in a way. People, women were lace makers. There were merchants who were working with the women in their homes. So
Okay.
it wasn't like a schoolgirl art. I think you may have learned it, but they were not making lace for the family.
Okay.
No, I think it was more of a business. There were a lot of women who were actually controlling the lace trades too, which is interesting.
Well, thank
There
you
any
for
more?
speaking today, and
Great.
thank you all for joining us.
Thank you all very much.